Mr. Hubbard, many millions of words have been said and written about Scientology, but I think there's still quite a lot of doubt in many people's minds as to exactly what it is. What is Scientology? How would you describe it?
Well, it's very interesting. You've just asked a question like, what are the contents of the Encyclopedia Britannica? Answer in one word.
Well, Mr. Hubbard, it's obviously something that's very wide-ranging. And if you can't describe it overall, perhaps we can begin at the beginning. How did you get into Scientology? How did it all start?
Well, that is fairly easy. When I was a very young man, I spent most of my teens in Asia. And that is an area of the world where human misery and want are very visible, where man has reached perhaps the lowest states of degradation. And a young man moving into that scene begins to ask the question, why? Why all this? Why? What is this? What depths can man fall to? And what is he anyway? And I began to ask this question, what is man? And I found, oddly enough, that nobody could tell me what man was. What did he consist of? Where was he going? What was he doing? I became very fascinated with this particular line of research, and I made it my life's work.
Did you read widely of philosophy?
Yes, but the philosopher, of course, has spent most of his working years in his ivory towers, and he was pretty insulated from life. To really know life, you've got to be part of life. You must get down and look. You must get into the nooks and crannies of existence. You have to rub elbows with all kinds and types of men before you can finally establish what he is.
And you, in fact, did this?
Yes, I've slept with bandits in Mongolia, and I've hunted with pygmies in the Philippines. As a matter of fact, I have studied 21 different primitive races, including the white race. And my conclusions were that man, regardless of his state of culture and so forth, was essentially the same, that he was composed of, he was a spiritual being. And he was a spiritual being that was pulled down to the material, the fleshly interests, to an interplay in life that was, in fact, too great for him to confront. And I concluded finally that he needed a hand.
Now, what was the first step in the formulation of Scientology? What was the first piece of knowledge that you uncovered?
Well, that is an interesting question, because when I first entered a university, I took science and mathematics. I was forced to take this rather than philosophy, which was my natural bent. And I learned the rules of logic and the scientific approach. These things, by the way, are not generally known to philosophers. And my first effort was to find a common denominator to all men. And I had seen him in his more primitive states, and I'd seen him in his highly cultured states. And I said, somewhere one can isolate a common denominator that embraces all men. And perhaps from that we can unlock this riddle.
You mentioned just now that you discovered for yourself that man was a spirit. Are you here comparing Scientology with a religion, any religion in fact, that also sees man as a spirit?
Well, man has conceived man to be a spirit for many more years than he has conceived man to be an animal or a materialistic thing. We have a 2,000-year history of man as a spirit, whereas we only have less than a century of considering simply mud. And therefore, my study is more traditional than most philosophies. Now, when you get most modern renditions and so forth, but man poses a great many problems, and he is so varied from culture to culture, from type to type, race to race, that when I discovered the common denominator of existence and so forth, I was away, and I could go forward from that point, and I did discover that.
Can you now take us forward from this point and tell us where you went when you made that first discovery of yours?
Well, I discovered that the common denominator of existence was survive. Whatever else man was trying to do, whether he was cultured or primitive and so on, he was attempting to survive. And then one had to move forward from this point to find out what methods he used to survive, how he adapted himself to environments in his attempted survivals and so on. And one found out that man advanced to the degree that he preserved his spiritual integrity, that he preserved his values, that he remained honest, that he remained decent, and he disintegrated or deteriorated to the degree that he abandoned these things and adopted more evil courses and so on.
Now, how can Scientology help man, universal man, to overcome the problems he faces?
Very simple. You see, we live in a world where we have governments and we have societies and so forth who are desperately trying to help man. They are trying, however, to solve his problems for him. And their efforts to solve his problems for him and so forth have not really resulted in any great advance for man. Now, the real work here is to put man in a mental condition where he can solve his own problems. And the aim and goal of Scientology is to take an individual or a group, and by taking the individuals in the group, put them in a position where they can confront their own problems and solve their own problems, and so bring themselves up by their own bootstraps. No amount of, well, let me put it this way. Have you ever had a friend that you tried to give advice to, who then took it and went along fine? Or have you had friends that when you gave advice to them and so on, why, they rather resented it and didn't take it? Have you ever had such a condition?
Yes.
Well, very good. Let's put this on a much broader basis. If we take a man and we keep giving him advice and giving him help and pushing him along and so on, we don't necessarily wind up with a resolution of his problems. But if, on the other hand, we put him in a position where he had higher intelligence, where his reaction time was better, where he could confront life better, where he could identify the factors in his life more easily, then he's in a position where he can solve his own problems. So he looks around, he starts solving his own problems, and so he betters his own life. That is the difference between Scientology and other efforts to help man.
Mr. Hubbard, admittedly, this would seem to be both a mental and a physical approach to living in this world, to helping people to live in this world. But where does the spiritual side come into Scientology?
Well, it's very interesting. The more you try to help man physically, apparently the less progress you make. It was only when we began to treat man, and when I began to treat man, as a spiritual being who was not really dependent upon the body or the flesh, that I made any progress at all. Man is a spiritual being. He is not a piece of flesh. And when you begin to handle man on the basis that he is a spirit, that he has unlimited ability, that he is not necessarily pinned down into, you know, like everybody has just so much IQ and they never can have any further IQ. When we start that approach, you see, we lose. But when we say he is a spirit of infinite capability, and then we try to improve that capability, in that way we win, and we win very, very, very profitably, very easily.
Through Scientology, is it possible to reach towards God?
Oh, very definitely. A Scientologist, before he has gone very far, begins to realize the nature of the universe. He realizes that this didn't all just occur spontaneously one fine day out of some scientific formula. And he realized there must have been an author to all of these things. And he also realizes, oddly enough, in his own participation,